At Williamsburg, he spent $55 million to restore Virginia's colonial capital to an idealized version of the past. At the Cloisters, a museum on the northern tip of Manhattan, he created a medieval retreat and filled it with ancient treasures.
Junior's interest in art went backwards. He was interested in older art, historical art. And certainly that is what the Cloisters displays beautifully.
But while Junior sought peace in the old, his wife, Abby, found excitement in the new.
She was attracted by the unusual, adventurous, inner-directed art. She liked experimentation. She was open to new ideas. And also, she wanted to understand the art that her children would grow up to understand. In other words, she wanted to be a modern.
Mother liked beauty wherever she found it, and she found it in many different places, both in nature and in contemporary art, and that's where they pretty much parted company.
In 1939, after 10 years in a temporary home, the Museum of Modern Art, MoMA, opened its doors.
Just off Fifth Avenue, on a site long occupied by the old-fashioned town dwellings of the Rockefeller family, stands the spanking new home of a nationally important institution.
Junior not only donated over $6 million, but had the Rockefeller home torn down to make room for the museum. In exchange, he extracted a promise.
Abby made a bargain with Junior that they sell their property on 54th Street and move to an apartment. And he agreed to do it, provided she agreed to cut back most of her activities at MoMA. He was concerned about her health then, which was beginning to fail, and so she used that as a bargaining chip.
For the Rockefellers, the Museum of Modern Art would always be known as Mother's Museum. If Mother had a museum, Father had a monument.
Rockefeller Center will always be the place that the Rockefellers can point to. It's the physical embodiment of what their family accomplished. It's putting the family stamp right on the face of New York City and therefore on the face of America.
It had been conceived in 1928 as yet another philanthropy, a new home for the Metropolitan Opera, and development of the surrounding three-block area. But then the stock market crashed in 1929, ruining millions of investors and wiping out more than half of the Rockefeller fortune. Junior developed shingles, frequent severe colds. I walk the floors at night wondering where I'm going to get the money to build these buildings, he wrote.
He stuck with a couple of rather substantial blocks of property. He has to pay lease payments on them. He has to pay property taxes on them. And this is the absolute rock bottom of the country's economic history. He can eat the loss, or he can do something which is really very, very risky.
Junior had been humiliated by the failure of his first business venture 30 years before. Now he rose to the challenge. He put up nearly 1/3 of his diminished fortune and gambled on the massive project. With 13 buildings surrounding a 70-story tower, Rockefeller Center was designed on an epic scale, described as a mixture of brashness and grandeur. Employing 75,000 workers, it was the only major construction project in New York City in the grim days of the Great Depression.
And this is an act of faith in America, and I think Americans were fascinated by the size, the magnitude, and the fact that this man, this family, believed that there was a future for the country. And this great monument was in effect built for that.
In what would become a yearly tradition, grateful workers lit the first Christmas tree at Rockefeller Center in 1933.
Passing by, passing by.
In his vigorous old age, John D. Rockefeller spoke often of reaching 100 years. He died on March 23, 1937, at his winter home in Ormond Beach, just 2 years short of his goal. To the end of his days, the king of Standard Oil, long vilified as monstrous, evil, cruel, believed that he was at peace with God.
I've carried this verse in my purse for so long I can't remember. It's a quote from my grandfather. I was early taught to work as well as play. My life has been one long, happy holiday. Full of work and full of play, I dropped the worry on the way, and God was good to me every day.
The funeral was held at Kykuit, the symbolic seat of the Rockefeller family, and now Junior's home. All over the world, in every office, company, and refinery of the former Standard Oil empire, work ceased for 5 minutes.
Rockefeller Center, a city within a city, reaches completion after 8 years of construction. Planned in boom times and built during the Depression, the center juts into the sky above the...
In 1939, as he put the last rivet in Rockefeller Center, John D. Rockefeller Jr., now 65, could look back on a life of achievement. No man in America lived up to his ideals more than John D. Rockefeller Jr., said Ida Tarbell, the journalist whose expose of Standard Oil had so tarnished the family name. I know of no father that has given better guidance to his son than has John D. Rockefeller.
By spreading his philanthropy as broadly as he did, Jr. gave a very large number of people reasons to remember the Rockefellers that had nothing to do with Standard Oil, that had nothing to do with Ida Tarbell, but that had to do with beauty and nature and scientific progress.
He succeeded to such an extent that by the time his own children reached adulthood in the 1930s, it was probably very difficult for them to imagine the firestorm of controversy that had surrounded the Rockefeller name only 30 years before.
John D. Jr. has created this remarkable family, these 5 boisterous boys, and all of them with great promise. But there is a kind of peril, and he sees it early on, and that is that they can undo with careless gestures the work it has taken him 30 or 40 years to complete.